In the opulent halls of Astoria Palace, where centuries of tradition dictate every breath and whisper, a single piece of jewelry holds the power to shatter a kingdom. The midnight crown, adorned with the legendary tiers of Astoria sapphires, has been worn by only 3 queens in the nation's 1,000-year history. Each time it graced a royal head, it marked either the beginning of a golden age or the end of a dynasty. When 15-year-old Princess Isabella discovers the crown hidden in her late mother's chambers, she unknowingly sets in motion a chain of events that will expose decades of buried secrets, challenge the very foundation of the monarchy, and force her stepmother, Queen Evangeline, to confront the dark truth she has spent years concealing. But some secrets are buried so deep that unearthing them threatens not just crowns and titles, but the very lives of those who dare to seek the truth. In a world where power is everything and trust is a luxury few can afford, Isabella must choose between the comfort of ignorance and the dangerous pursuit of justice. The crown calls to her, whispering promises of truth and warnings of devastation in equal measure. And in the shadows of the palace, those who have kept the secret for so long will stop at nothing to ensure it remains buried forever. What price would you pay for the truth? And when the crown chooses its next bearer, will the kingdom rise to glory or fall into ruin? The autumn rain drummed against the towering windows of Astoria Palace as Princess Isabella made her way through the dimly lit corridor of the East Wing. At 15, she possessed the kind of natural grace that came from years of royal training, yet her steps carried a restless energy that palace tutors had never quite managed to tame. Her dark hair, so reminiscent of her late mother, Queen Serafina, caught the flickering light of the ornate chandeliers as she paused before a door that had remained locked for 3 years. The East Wing had been her mother's domain, sealed off after the tragic accident that claimed Queen Serafina's life when Isabella was just 12. King Alexander had declared it a shrine to his beloved wife's memory, but Isabella knew the truth was far more complicated. Her stepmother, Queen Evangeline, couldn't bear the sight of Serafina's belongings, and her father found the memories too painful to confront. Isabella pulled the ornate key from beneath her silk blouse, where she had worn it on a chain ever since discovering it hidden in her mother's jewelry box the week before. The key felt warm against her palm, almost alive with possibility. She had spent days working up the courage to use it, knowing that whatever lay beyond that door would change everything. The lock turned with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting for this moment. The heavy oak door creaked open, revealing a sitting room frozen in time. Dust motes danced in the pale afternoon light filtering through rain-streaked windows, and the air carried the faint scent of her mother's favorite lavender perfume. Isabella stepped inside, her heart racing with a mixture of grief and anticipation. Everything remained exactly as Queen Serafina had left it. Books lay open on the mahogany writing desk, their pages yellowed with age. A half-finished embroidery project sat in a basket beside her favorite armchair, the needle still threaded with golden silk. Fresh flowers had once filled the crystal vases that now held only dried stems, their petals long since fallen to the Persian carpet below. Isabella moved through the room like a pilgrim visiting a sacred site, touching objects that still held traces of her mother's presence. She remembered sitting in this very room for afternoon tea, listening to her mother's stories about the ancient queens of Astoria and their legendary strength in times of crisis. Serafina had always spoken of the crown jewels with reverence, particularly the midnight crown, which she claimed chose its own wearers based on their worthiness to lead the kingdom. The memory drew Isabella toward her mother's private study, a smaller room connected to the sitting area by French doors. Here, Queen Serafina had conducted her charitable work and maintained extensive correspondence with dignitaries from across the realm. The study felt more intimate than the formal sitting room, filled with personal photographs and mementos from Isabella's childhood. As Isabella explored the familiar space, she noticed something peculiar about the bookshelf that lined the far wall. Several books seemed newer than the others, their spines less faded by sunlight and age. She approached for a closer look and discovered that these volumes were actually journals, bound in leather and marked with dates spanning the last 10 years of her mother's life. With trembling hands, Isabella pulled out the most recent journal, dated just months before her mother's death. The leather binding was soft and supple, clearly well used. She opened to a random page and immediately recognized her mother's elegant handwriting, though the words themselves made her blood run cold. "The truth about the midnight crown weighs heavily on my heart," read one entry. "Evangeline grows more suspicious each day, and I fear she has discovered what I've been hiding. If something should happen to me, Isabella must know the real reason the crown was taken from public display. She must understand that her birthright extends far beyond what the kingdom believes." Isabella sank into her mother's chair, the journal clutched against her chest. Her mother had mentioned the midnight crown often during their private conversations, but always in terms of history and tradition. The crown had been the most precious artifact in the royal collection, worn only by queens who had proven themselves worthy through acts of extraordinary courage and wisdom. It had disappeared from public view shortly after Isabella's birth, and the official explanation was that it required extensive restoration work. But this journal entry suggested something far more sinister. Isabella flipped through more pages, finding references to the true heir, dangerous knowledge, and Evangeline's ambition. The picture that emerged painted her stepmother not as the devoted wife and caring stepmother she appeared to be, but as someone willing to do anything to secure her own position and that of her children. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside made Isabella's heart skip. She quickly returned the journal to its place on the shelf and looked around for somewhere to hide. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by voices she recognized all too well. "I don't understand why you won't simply have the East Wing cleaned out and repurposed," came Queen Evangeline's crisp voice. "It's been 3 years, Alexander. Serafina wouldn't want this shrine-like behavior to continue indefinitely." "Perhaps you're right," King Alexander replied, his voice heavy with the weariness that had marked him since his wife's death. "But Isabella might want some of her mother's things. We should ask her first." "Isabella is at her writing lesson," Evangeline said dismissively. "And frankly, dwelling on the past isn't healthy for a girl her age. She needs to focus on her future responsibilities, not cling to memories of a mother who can't guide her anymore." Isabella pressed herself against the wall beside the study door, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She had never heard Evangeline speak so coldly about her mother before, at least not when Isabella or her father might overhear. "Evangeline, I know you've tried to be a good mother to Isabella, but Serafina was obsessed with that ridiculous crown and those old legends," Evangeline interrupted, her voice sharp with irritation. She filled Isabella's head with nonsense about divine right and chosen queens. It's time for Isabella to understand that the monarchy has evolved beyond such primitive superstitions. There was a long pause before King Alexander responded. "The midnight crown represents centuries of tradition. Serafina understood its importance to our people." "A crown represents nothing but outdated symbolism," Evangeline snapped. "And its mysterious disappearance has allowed us to move forward with a more modern approach to royal ceremony." "Some things are better left buried, Alexander." Isabella felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath her feet. Her stepmother wasn't just dismissive of the crown's significance. She seemed almost relieved that it had vanished. The journal entries suddenly made perfect sense. Her mother had been protecting something, and Evangeline had been working to eliminate that protection. The voices began to fade as the royal couple moved further down the corridor, but Isabella remained frozen against the wall for several more minutes. When she finally found the courage to move, she returned to the bookshelf and began pulling out more journals, looking for additional clues about the crown's true fate. The journals revealed a complex web of palace intrigue that Isabella had been completely unaware of. Her mother had suspected Evangeline of having affairs before marrying the king, and had uncovered evidence that Evangeline's first marriage had ended under suspicious circumstances. More troubling still were references to documents that could prove Isabella's true significance to the kingdom, and warnings about those who would see the proper bloodline extinguished. As afternoon faded into evening, Isabella discovered the most shocking entry of all, written just days before her mother's fatal riding accident. In hurried, almost frantic handwriting, Queen Serafina had recorded her greatest fear: "I can no longer ignore the evidence. Evangeline orchestrated my predecessor's death to clear her path to the throne, and now she sees Isabella as the final obstacle to her children's inheritance. The crown is hidden where only Isabella will think to look, along with proof of everything. If I should die unexpectedly, the truth must not die with me." Isabella stared at the page until the words blurred together. Her mother hadn't died in a simple riding accident. She had been murdered by the woman who now sat on her throne and shared her father's bed. And somewhere in this very room, the midnight crown waited with evidence that could expose the truth and restore justice to the kingdom. But first, Isabella had to find it. She began searching the study systematically, checking every drawer, every bookshelf, every decorative object for hidden compartments or clues. Her mother had been clever and secretive, someone who understood the importance of protecting valuable information from prying eyes. The hiding place would be somewhere meaningful to Isabella personally, somewhere that only she would think to explore. As the palace clock tower chimed 9 o'clock, Isabella realized she had been searching for hours without success. Her absence from dinner would surely be noticed, and questions would be asked about her whereabouts. She needed to return to her chambers before anyone came looking for her. But as she prepared to leave the study, her gaze fell upon a portrait of herself as a child, painted when she was 7 years old. In the painting, she sat in this very room, wearing her favorite blue dress and holding a music box that her mother had given her for her birthday. Isabella remembered that music box well. It played a haunting melody that her mother claimed was the ancient coronation song of Astoria's first queen. The music box still sat on a shelf near the portrait, its golden surface tarnished with age. Isabella lifted it carefully and wound the tiny key on its base. The familiar melody filled the quiet study, just as beautiful and mysterious as she remembered. But as the song reached its climax, Isabella noticed something different about the sound. There was a subtle hollow quality, as if the music box contained more than just its delicate mechanisms. With careful fingers, she examined the base of the box and discovered a tiny catch hidden beneath the velvet lining. When pressed, it released a secret compartment that contained a folded piece of parchment and a small silver key. Isabella's hand shook as she unfolded the parchment and recognized her mother's handwriting once again. "My dearest Isabella," the note began, "if you are reading this, then my worst fears have come to pass. The crown lies where music and memory meet, protected by the songs of our ancestors. Use the silver key with wisdom, and remember that the truth is worth any sacrifice. Trust no one in the palace except Captain Morrison of the Guard, who served your grandmother faithfully and knows the full history of our family's burden. The kingdom's future rests in your hands, my brave daughter." Isabella clutched the note and the silver key to her chest, tears streaming down her face. Her mother had known she was in danger and had prepared for the worst, trusting that Isabella would be clever enough to follow the clues and brave enough to face whatever truth lay hidden. But where could music and memory meet, refer to? Isabella knew every room in the palace, every hiding place she had discovered during years of childhood exploration. The phrase seemed to point to somewhere specific, somewhere connected to both musical instruments and cherished memories. Then she remembered the old music room in the tower, where her great-grandmother had once taught piano to the royal children. The room had been abandoned for decades, deemed too remote and inconvenient for modern palace life. But Isabella had sometimes snuck up there as a child, drawn by the dusty old piano and the portraits of long-dead queens that lined the walls. If her mother had hidden the midnight crown anywhere in the palace, the forgotten music room would be the perfect location. Remote, rarely visited, but filled with the kind of historical significance that would appeal to someone who treasured the old traditions. Isabella carefully returned the music box to its shelf and slipped both the silver key and her mother's note into her bodice. Tomorrow, she would find a way to reach the tower music room without being observed. Tonight, she needed to return to her chambers and pretend that nothing had changed, that she was still the innocent princess everyone believed her to be. But as she locked her mother's rooms and made her way through the darkened corridors of the palace, Isabella knew that her childhood had ended forever. She was no longer just a princess learning proper etiquette and royal protocol. She was the keeper of dangerous secrets, the potential witness to regicide, and possibly the only person who could ensure that justice was finally served. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden, but it also filled her with a sense of purpose she had never experienced before. Her mother had trusted her with the most important task imaginable, uncovering the truth and protecting the kingdom from those who would corrupt its ancient traditions for personal gain. As Isabella slipped into her bedchambers and prepared for what might be her last night of innocence, she whispered a promise to her mother's memory. Whatever the cost, whatever the danger, she would find the midnight crown and expose Queen Evangeline's crimes. The true Queen of Astoria would have her justice at last. Dawn broke grey and cold over Astoria Palace, matching Isabella's mood as she sat at her dressing table, pretending to focus on the day's lessons while her mind raced with plans to reach the tower music room. Her lady-in-waiting, Sarah, bustled about the chamber, preparing Isabella's clothes for the morning's etiquette lesson, completely unaware that her young mistress had uncovered evidence of murder and conspiracy in the depths of the East Wing. Isabella studied her reflection in the ornate mirror, searching for any sign that her world had fundamentally shifted overnight. She looked the same as always, dark hair swept back in an elegant chignon, green eyes that had inherited her mother's intelligence and depth, skin that still held the bloom of youth despite the weight of terrible knowledge. But behind those familiar features lay a determination that would have surprised anyone who knew her only as the dutiful princess. "Your Highness seems distracted this morning," Sarah observed as she laid out a forest green dress adorned with the silver phoenix emblem of the royal house. "Did you sleep poorly?" "Just thinking about my upcoming responsibilities," Isabella replied, which was true enough. She would indeed have new responsibilities, though not the kind Sarah imagined. The morning proceeded with agonizing normalcy. Isabella sat through her etiquette lesson with Madame Dubois, nodding appropriately as the stern Frenchwoman lectured about proper posture during state dinners. She endured her politics tutorial with Professor Henley, who droned on about trade agreements and diplomatic protocol, while Isabella's thoughts remained fixed on her mother's hidden journal and the silver key burning against her skin. During the midday meal, Isabella found herself studying Queen Evangeline with new eyes. Her stepmother sat at the head of the long dining table with perfect poise, her golden hair arranged in an elaborate style that showcased the ruby tiara she favored for informal occasions. To anyone else, Evangeline appeared to be exactly what she claimed, a devoted wife and caring stepmother who had stepped gracefully into her role after tragedy struck the royal family. But Isabella now noticed subtle details that had escaped her attention before. The way Evangeline's smile never quite reached her calculating blue eyes. The practiced nature of her expressions of concern and affection. The careful way she steered conversations away from any mention of Queen Seraphina or the old palace traditions. "Isabella, darling, you've barely touched your lunch," Evangeline said, her voice carrying just the right note of maternal worry. "Are you feeling well?" "I'm fine, thank you," Isabella replied politely. "Perhaps a bit tired from my studies." Of course, growing girls need their rest. Evangeline's gaze lingered on Isabella's face, as if searching for signs of something specific. "I was thinking we might spend some time together this afternoon. There are certain aspects of royal protocol that you'll need to understand as you approach your coming-of-age ceremony." Isabella's pulse quickened. The coming-of-age ceremony was still months away when she would officially become heir apparent and begin taking on greater responsibilities within the kingdom. But more importantly for her current mission, it would provide the perfect excuse for exploring parts of the palace that she hadn't visited recently. "I would be honored by your guidance," Isabella said carefully. "Though I wonder if we might postpone our discussion until tomorrow. I had hoped to spend some time in the library today, researching the history of royal ceremonies. I want to understand the traditions thoroughly." Something flickered in Evangeline's eyes. Suspicion, perhaps, or concern. But her smile remained perfectly composed. "What a thoughtful idea. Yes, understanding our history is quite important. Though I do hope you won't focus too heavily on the more outdated aspects of royal tradition. The monarchy must evolve with the times." "Of course," Isabella agreed, though she noticed how her stepmother consistently dismissed anything connected to the old ways. "I'm particularly interested in learning about the crown jewels and their significance to past ceremonies." This time, Evangeline's reaction was unmistakable. Her fork paused halfway to her mouth and her eyes sharpened with something that might have been alarm. "The crown jewels? Whatever for. Well, I assume I'll be expected to wear some of them during my ceremony," Isabella said, affecting innocence. "I'd like to understand their history and meaning." "Most of the significant pieces are in storage for restoration," Evangeline replied quickly. "The ceremony will use more practical alternatives that better suit modern sensibilities." Isabella nodded, as if satisfied with this explanation, but internally she filed away yet another confirmation of her mother's journal entries. Evangeline was actively working to distance the monarchy from its traditional symbols of power, particularly those connected to the ancient queens who had earned their crowns through personal worthiness rather than marriage or birth. After lunch, Isabella made her way to the palace library, but not for the reason she had told her stepmother. The library occupied most of the second floor of the north wing, and its upper levels provided access to several forgotten passages that connected to other parts of the palace. If she could find the right route, she might be able to reach the tower music room without using the main corridors where servants and guards might observe her movements. The head librarian, Mr. Carstairs, greeted Isabella warmly as she entered the main reading room. He was an elderly man who had served the royal family for over 30 years, and he remembered Queen Seraphina with obvious fondness. "Your Highness," he said with a respectful bow. "How may I assist you today?" "I'm researching the history of royal ceremonies," Isabella said, which was partly true, particularly the traditions surrounding the coming-of-age ceremony and the use of crown jewels. Mr. J. Carstairs' weathered face lit up with enthusiasm. "Ah, a fascinating topic indeed. Your dear mother was quite interested in such matters. She spent many hours in this very library, studying the old records and genealogies." Isabella's heart skipped. "Did she?" "I'd love to see the same materials she found most useful. Ascertaining. I believe I can locate the exact texts she consulted most frequently." He disappeared into the stacks and returned with an armload of leather-bound volumes. These contain the most comprehensive records of royal ceremonies dating back to the founding of the kingdom. Your mother was particularly fascinated by the accounts of Queen Aria the Wise, our first monarch. Isabella accepted the books gratefully and settled at a table near one of the tall windows that offered a view of the palace gardens. As she opened the first volume, she marveled at the detailed illustrations of past ceremonies, including several depictions of the legendary Midnight Crown. The crown was even more beautiful than she had imagined, its sapphires seeming to glow within a fire, even in the faded paintings. But more important than the crown's beauty were the stories surrounding it. According to the ancient records, the Midnight Crown possessed the power to reveal truth and expose deception. Queens who wore it were said to gain supernatural insight into the hearts and minds of those around them, making them impossible to deceive or manipulate. The crown chose its own bearers, refusing to rest comfortably on the head of anyone unworthy of its power. As Isabella read deeper into the historical accounts, she began to understand why her mother had been so protective of the crown and why Evangeline would want it permanently hidden. If the legends were even partially true, the crown would expose Evangeline's crimes the moment Isabella placed it on her head during any public ceremony. The afternoon sun slanted lower through the library windows as Isabella continued her research, but she kept one eye on the door to monitor the comings and goings of other library visitors. When she was certain that she was alone except for Mr. Carstairs, who had retreated to his office to catalogue new acquisitions, she made her move. Isabella had discovered years ago that the library's upper level contained a narrow staircase hidden behind a tapestry depicting the Battle of Thornfield. The staircase led to the old servants' passages that honeycombed the palace walls, providing discrete routes between different sections of the building. With luck, one of those passages would lead close enough to the tower to allow her to reach the music room undetected. The hidden staircase was dusty and poorly lit, illuminated only by occasional windows that let in filtered daylight from the inner courtyards. Isabella lifted her skirts carefully as she climbed, trying to avoid making noise that might attract attention from the library below. At the top of the stairs, she found herself in a narrow corridor that stretched in both directions, punctuated by doorways that led to various parts of the palace. Isabella had explored these passages as a child, though never with such a serious purpose. She remembered that the corridor running toward the east led eventually to the tower section of the palace, though the exact route was complicated by several dead ends and confusing intersections. She would have to rely on her childhood memories and her sense of direction to find her way. The passage grew colder as she moved away from the inhabited sections of the palace, and Isabella began to hear the creaking and settling sounds that old buildings made when left largely empty. Cobwebs brushed against her face, and she had to step carefully around loose floorboards that might give way under her weight. After what felt like an hour of careful navigation, Isabella finally reached a doorway that she believed led to the tower. The door was heavy oak banded with iron, clearly very old but still solid. She pressed her ear against it, listening for any sounds from the other side, but heard only silence. The door opened with a harsh squeal that made Isabella wince, but beyond it lay exactly what she had hoped to find: the narrow spiral staircase that led up to the tower's various levels. The music room was on the third floor, she remembered, just below the tower's highest point, where an observatory had been built for the royal family's use in studying astronomy. The tower staircase was even more neglected than the hidden passages, its stone steps worn smooth by centuries of use but now thick with dust and debris. Isabella climbed slowly, pausing on each landing to listen for any indication that her presence had been detected. The tower felt completely isolated from the rest of the palace, a forgotten relic of older times when such spaces had served important functions. The door to the music room stood slightly ajar, revealing a slice of dusty interior lit by pale afternoon sunlight. Isabella pushed it open carefully and stepped into a space that seemed frozen in time even more completely than her mother's chambers had been. The music room was smaller than she remembered from her childhood visits, but it retained an air of faded grandeur that spoke to its former importance in palace life. A grand piano dominated the center of the room, its ebony surface dulled by years of neglect but still maintaining the elegant lines that marked it as a masterpiece of craftsmanship. Sheet music lay scattered across the piano bench and nearby music stands, as if the last performer had simply walked away in the middle of a lesson. The walls were lined with portraits of royal women dating back centuries, each painted in the formal style of her era, but all sharing a certain strength of character that transcended changes in fashion and artistic technique. Isabella recognized some of the faces from her history lessons: Queen Aria the Wise, who had founded the kingdom; Queen Constance the Just, who had reformed the legal system; Queen Beatrice the Bold, who had led armies against foreign invaders. But it was the portrait hanging directly above the piano that made Isabella's breath catch in her throat. The painting showed a woman who looked remarkably like Isabella herself, with the same dark hair and intelligent green eyes. According to the brass nameplate beneath the frame, this was Queen Serenity the True, who had ruled 3 centuries earlier and was remembered as the most honest and discerning monarch in the kingdom's history.
Isabella approached the portrait slowly, drawn by the uncanny resemblance and by something in Queen Serenity's painted expression that seemed to beckon her closer.
As she stood directly before the painting, she noticed that the queen wore a crown that matched the descriptions in the library books perfectly, the legendary midnight crown. Its sapphires seeming to glow within a light even in the static medium of oil paint. More intriguingly, Queen Serenity's painted eyes seemed to be looking directly at something below the portrait, as if directing the viewer's attention to a specific point. Isabella followed the gaze and found herself looking at the piano bench, which appeared to be an ordinary piece of furniture except for a small decorative rose carved into its side. Remembering her mother's note about music and memory, Isabella examined the carved rose more closely. It was slightly raised from the surrounding wood, and when she pressed it gently, it moved with a soft click. A hidden panel slid open in the side of the bench, revealing a compartment just large enough to hold a small object. Isabella's heart raced as she reached into the compartment and felt the smooth surface of what could only be a jeweled crown. She lifted it carefully into the light and gasped at the sight of the most beautiful piece of jewelry she had ever seen. The midnight crown was smaller than she had expected, designed to rest lightly on the wearer's head rather than dominate it with overwhelming grandeur. The gold was warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with its own inner life, while the sapphires captured and reflected the afternoon sunlight in a display of brilliant blues that ranged from deep ocean to pale sky. But more than its physical beauty, the crown seemed to radiate a sense of power and purpose that Isabella could feel even before placing it on her head. This was not merely a piece of jewelry or a symbol of authority. It was an artifact imbued with the wisdom and strength of all the queens who had worn it before her. As Isabella held the crown, she became aware of a rustling sound from the hidden compartment. She reached in again and found several folded documents that her mother had apparently stored along with the crown. The papers were covered with her mother's handwriting, but also included older documents that appeared to be official records and testimonies. The first document was a letter from her mother addressed to Isabella and dated just days before Queen Serafina's death. In it, her mother explained that she had discovered proof of Evangeline's involvement in the suspicious death of King Alexander's first wife, Isabella's predecessor as queen. Evangeline had been lady-in-waiting to the previous queen and had poisoned her slowly over a period of months, making her death appear to be the result of a wasting illness. But even more shocking was the revelation that followed. According to genealogical records that Queen Serafina had uncovered, Isabella was not just the king's daughter by his second marriage. She was the direct descendant of the ancient royal bloodline through her mother's side, making her the rightful heir to the throne regardless of her father's choice of successor. The other documents provided evidence to support this claim: birth records, marriage certificates, and sworn statements from elderly nobles who remembered Isabella's maternal grandmother and her own royal heritage. Queen Serafina had been the legitimate heir to the throne in her own right, and her marriage to King Alexander had united two branches of the royal family that had been separated for generations. Isabella sank onto the piano bench, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had discovered. Not only was Evangeline a murderer who had killed at least two queens to secure her own position, but Isabella herself had a stronger claim to the throne than her half-siblings or even her own father. As she sat in the dusty music room surrounded by portraits of her ancestors, Isabella began to understand the full weight of the responsibility that had fallen on her shoulders. She was not just uncovering evidence of past crimes. She was potentially preventing future ones. If Evangeline had killed twice to secure her power, she would certainly kill again to protect it. The sound of approaching footsteps on the tower stairs made Isabella's blood turn to ice. Someone was climbing toward the music room, and she had nowhere to hide. Quickly, she wrapped the crown in her shawl and tucked the documents into her bodice, then moved to stand beside one of the tall windows, as if she had been admiring the view. The footsteps stopped outside the music room door, and Isabella held her breath, praying that whoever it was would simply pass by. But after a moment of silence, the door creaked open, and a familiar voice called her name.
"Your Highness, are you in here?"
Isabella nearly collapsed with relief as she recognized the voice of Captain Morrison, the head of the royal guard whom her mother had mentioned in her note as the only person in the palace who could be trusted completely. "Captain Morrison," she called back, trying to keep her voice steady. "Yes, I'm here." The captain entered the music room, his weathered face creased with concern. He was a man in his 50s who had served the royal family with unwavering loyalty for over 20 years, and Isabella had always felt safe in his presence. Now, knowing that her mother had trusted him with the family's secrets, She felt a wave of gratitude for his arrival. Your Highness, when you didn't appear for your afternoon lessons, Queen Evangeline became quite concerned, Captain Morrison said carefully. She asked me to search for you. Isabella studied his expression, looking for any sign that he might be aware of her true purpose in the tower. I was exploring the palace and lost track of time, she said, which was essentially true. Captain Morrison's eyes moved briefly to the portrait of Queen Serenity, then back to Isabella's face. This room holds many memories, he said quietly. Your mother used to come here sometimes when she needed to think. The emphasis he placed on the word think suggested that he knew more about her mother's activities than he was openly admitting. Isabella decided to take a risk. Captain Morrison, did my mother ever speak to you about the old traditions? About the things that made our kingdom strong in past generations? The captain's expression grew very serious, and he stepped closer to speak in a low voice that wouldn't carry beyond the music room. Princess Isabella, there are some conversations that are best held in private. If you have questions about your mother's concerns, perhaps we could discuss them in my office this evening. Isabella nodded gratefully. I would like that very much.
Good.
But for now, we should return to the main palace, before your absence raises more questions. He paused, studying her face intently. Your Highness, I hope you understand that there are those who would not appreciate certain aspects of our family history being brought to light. I understand, Isabella replied, though the weight of the hidden crown against her body made her acutely aware that she was already far beyond the point of simple caution. As they made their way back through the palace corridors, Isabella felt the crown's presence like a talisman of protection and power. She had found her mother's legacy and uncovered the truth about her own heritage. Now, she needed to decide how to use that knowledge to protect the kingdom and ensure that justice was finally served. But first, she would need allies who could help her navigate the dangerous political waters that lay ahead. Captain Morrison was clearly one such ally, but Isabella suspected she would need more than the loyalty of a single guard captain to challenge someone as cunning and ruthless as Queen Evangeline. The game had begun in earnest, and Isabella was no longer just a piece being moved around the board. She was a player with her own agenda and the power to change the outcome of the match. The question now was whether she could master the rules quickly enough to survive what was certain to be a deadly contest of wills. The evening shadows lengthened across Captain Morrison's private office as Isabella sat across from the man who had become her most trusted ally in the dangerous game she now found herself playing. The office was spartanly furnished but comfortable, reflecting the captain's practical nature and dedication to duty. Heavy curtains blocked the windows, ensuring their conversation would remain private, while a small fire crackled in the grate, providing both warmth and a reassuring sense of normalcy. Isabella had spent the hours since their encounter in the music room carefully preparing for this conversation. She had hidden the midnight crown in a secret compartment behind her bedroom mirror, wrapped in silk and protected by a small charm her mother had given her years ago. The documents proving her royal lineage were secured in a different location, sewn into the lining of a traveling cloak that she never used. She had learned from her mother's example that dangerous secrets required multiple layers of protection. Your Highness, Captain Morrison began, settling into the chair behind his desk. I believe your mother would be proud to see how much you've grown in wisdom and courage. But she would also be deeply concerned about the path you're now walking. Isabella straightened her shoulders, drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. Captain Morrison, I know about the crown. I know about my mother's death, and I know about Queen Evangeline's crimes. The captain's weathered face showed no surprise, only a deep sadness that spoke of secrets carried too long in solitude. I was afraid this day would come, he said quietly. Your mother made me promise to protect you from this knowledge until you were old enough to handle its implications. But circumstances have forced events to move more quickly than any of us anticipated. Tell me everything, Isabella said, leaning forward intently. I need to understand what really happened to my mother, and why Evangeline is so determined to hide the truth about our family's heritage. Captain Morrison rose and moved to a painting on the wall behind his desk, depicting a battle scene from the kingdom's early history. He pressed a hidden catch, and the painting swung aside to reveal a small safe. From it, he withdrew a leather portfolio that Isabella recognized as matching the style of her mother's journals. Your mother entrusted me with this before her death, he explained, placing the portfolio on the desk between them. She suspected that Evangeline had discovered her investigation and might take drastic action to silence her. These documents contain the full scope of what she had learnt about Evangeline's past and her plans for the kingdom's future. Isabella opened the portfolio with trembling hands and found herself looking at a collection of documents that painted an even more sinister picture than she had imagined. There were copies of death certificates, witness statements, and financial records that traced a pattern of suspicious deaths and mysterious inheritances that followed Evangeline throughout her life. The woman who now wore the crown of Astoria had begun her career of murder and manipulation as a young noblewoman in a neighboring kingdom. Her first husband, a wealthy duke 20 years her senior, had died of apparent food poisoning just months after changing his will to leave her his entire estate. Her second husband, a prince from a minor royal house, had suffered a fatal riding accident shortly after their marriage, again leaving Evangeline as his sole heir. Most damning of all were the testimonies from servants and courtiers who had witnessed Evangeline's behavior during these suspicious deaths. She had shown no grief at her husband's funerals, had immediately begun making plans to dispose of their possessions, and had been overheard discussing her next opportunity with associates who were later found dead under equally mysterious circumstances. Your mother discovered all of this while researching genealogical records for your coming-of-age ceremony, Captain Morrison explained as Isabella read through the documents. She wanted to create a comprehensive family history that would highlight your connection to the ancient royal bloodline. But what she found instead was evidence that Evangeline had been systematically eliminating anyone who might challenge her path to ultimate power.
Isabella looked up from the papers, her mind reeling with the implications.
But why would she target my mother specifically? Evangeline was already queen by marriage. What more could she want? Captain Morrison's expression grew even graver. Your Highness, there's something else you need to understand about your position in the line of succession. According to the ancient laws of Astoria, which have never been formally repealed, the crown passes to the most direct descendant of the founding royal bloodline, regardless of gender or the circumstances of their parents' marriage.
He pulled out another document. This one bearing the official seals of the kingdom's highest legal authorities.
Your mother commissioned this legal analysis secretly, using scholars from the university who were unaware of its political implications. Their conclusion was unambiguous. You are the rightful heir to the throne of Astoria. Not because you are King Alexander's daughter, but because you are the direct descendant of Queen Aria the Wise, through your mother's bloodline. Isabella felt the room spinning around her as the full magnitude of her situation became clear. She wasn't just uncovering evidence of murder. She was discovering that she had a stronger legal claim to the throne than her own father. This means that Evangeline's children have no legitimate claim to succession, she said slowly, working through the implications. Even if something were to happen to me, the crown would pass to the next closest descendant of the original royal line, not to them.
Exactly, Captain Morrison confirmed.
Which explains why Evangeline became increasingly desperate to eliminate both you and your mother. She could maintain her position as queen consort as long as King Alexander lived, but she could never secure her children's inheritance while you remained alive to press your claim. Isabella closed her eyes, trying to process the overwhelming weight of responsibility that had suddenly fallen on her shoulders. She had gone from being a sheltered princess to being the target of a murderous conspiracy and the rightful heir to an entire kingdom, all in the space of a few days. What was my mother's plan? She asked. She must have had some strategy for exposing Evangeline's crimes and protecting the kingdom. Captain Morrison nodded grimly. Your mother intended to present her evidence to the High Council during your coming-of-age ceremony, when representatives from all the noble houses would be gathered in the capital. She planned to reveal your true heritage and formally challenge Evangeline's legitimacy as queen. The ceremony would have provided the perfect public forum for such revelations. But Evangeline discovered her plans and acted first, Isabella concluded. We believe so. Your mother's death was no accident, Your Highness. The horse that threw her had been drugged, and the route she took that morning had been suggested by one of Evangeline's ladies-in-waiting. It was carefully orchestrated to look like a tragic mishap while ensuring that your mother could never reveal what she had learned. Isabella felt a cold rage building in her chest, unlike anything she had ever experienced before. Her mother had died not in a simple accident, but as the victim of a calculated murder designed to protect Evangeline's stolen power. The woman who sat at her father's side each night, who pretended to care for Isabella's well-being, who spoke of family loyalty and royal duty, was nothing more than a common killer who had elevated murder to an art form. We have to expose her, Isabella said, her voice steady despite the fury burning inside her. We have to make sure that everyone knows what she's done and who she really is.
Your Highness, I share your desire for justice, Captain Morrison said carefully. But we must be extremely cautious in how we proceed.
Evangeline has had years to consolidate her power and eliminate potential threats. She has allies throughout the court, servants who report to her, and resources we can only guess at. If we move too quickly or carelessly, we could find ourselves joining your mother in an early grave. Isabella stood and began pacing the small office, her mind working furiously to develop a strategy that would expose Evangeline while keeping herself and her allies safe. What about my father? Surely he would listen if we presented him with evidence of Evangeline's crimes. Captain Morrison shook his head sadly. King Alexander is not the man he once was, Your Highness. Your mother's death shattered him, and he has become increasingly dependent on Evangeline for emotional support and guidance in running the kingdom. She has isolated him from many of his old advisors and surrounded him with people who serve her interests rather than his.
You're saying she's manipulating him as well?
I'm saying that your father sees what Evangeline wants him to see. She has convinced him that she is the devoted wife who has helped him through his darkest hour, and any evidence against her would be dismissed as the product of grief or political plotting by those who resent her rise to power.
Isabella sank back into her chair, feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation she faced.
It wasn't enough to simply possess evidence of Evangeline's crimes. She would need to find a way to present that evidence in a manner that couldn't be dismissed or suppressed by Evangeline's allies. What about the nobles? Are there families we could trust with this information? Captain Morrison considered the question carefully. There are several houses that remember your mother fondly and have grown uncomfortable with some of Evangeline's recent policies. Duke Aldrich of Westmarch was your mother's childhood friend and has privately expressed concerns about the kingdom's direction. Countess Vivian of Thornfield served as one of your mother's ladies-in-waiting and has remained loyal to her memory, and Lord Marquis of Ravenshollow has repeatedly questioned Evangeline's influence over the king's decisions. Could we trust them with the truth? Perhaps. But we would need to approach them carefully and individually. If even one of them betrayed our confidence to Evangeline, we would lose any element of surprise and likely face immediate retaliation. Isabella nodded, understanding that they were walking a tightrope between justice and survival. One wrong step could lead to disaster, not just for herself, but for anyone who chose to support her cause. There's another factor we must consider, Captain Morrison continued. Your coming-of-age ceremony is still scheduled for 3 months from now. Evangeline is already making preparations for the event, and I suspect she sees it as an opportunity to further consolidate her power and eliminate you as a potential threat. What do you mean? Think about it, Your Highness. The ceremony will bring together representatives from every noble house in the kingdom, foreign dignitaries, and thousands of common people. It would be the perfect time for a tragic accident to befall the young princess, something that would remove you from the succession permanently while appearing to be nothing more than a terrible misfortune. Isabella felt a chill run down her spine as she realized how vulnerable she would be during such a public event. Surrounded by crowds, distracted by ceremonial duties and trusting in traditions that Evangeline had no respect for, she would be an easy target for someone willing to commit murder in plain sight. Then we need to act before the ceremony, Isabella said firmly. We need to find a way to expose Evangeline's crimes and secure our evidence before she has the opportunity to eliminate me. Captain Morrison leaned forward, his expression intense.
Your Highness, what you're proposing is essentially a coup against the current government.
Even if we succeed in exposing Evangeline, there will be those who see your actions as treason against the crown. Are you prepared for that level of political upheaval? Isabella thought of her mother's journals, of the love and wisdom that had guided her, even from beyond the grave. She thought of the midnight crown, waiting in its hiding place with all the power and responsibility it represented. Most of all, she thought of the kingdom that deserved better than to be ruled by a murderer who had stolen her position through calculated violence. Captain Morrison, my mother died protecting the truth about our kingdom's heritage and the crimes being committed in the name of royal authority. I won't dishonor her memory by allowing those crimes to continue simply because challenging them might be dangerous or politically complicated. The captain studied her face for a long moment, then nodded with unmistakable respect. Your mother would indeed be proud, Your Highness. You have her strength and her sense of justice. Then help me plan how we're going to expose Evangeline and reclaim the throne for the rightful bloodline. For the next several hours, Isabella and Captain Morrison developed a careful strategy for gathering allies and building a case against Queen Evangeline that would be impossible to dismiss or suppress. They identified key nobles who might be sympathetic to their cause, servants within the palace who could provide additional evidence of Evangeline's suspicious activities, and scholars who could verify the legal documents supporting Isabella's claim to the throne. Most importantly, they planned how to reveal the truth in a way that would protect Isabella from immediate retaliation, while ensuring that the evidence reached enough people to make suppression impossible. "We'll need to move carefully over the next several weeks," Captain Morrison advised as their planning session drew to a close. "Evangeline is suspicious by nature, and any change in your behavior or routine could alert her to our activities. Continue with your normal lessons and social obligations, but begin building relationships with the nobles we've identified as potential allies." "What about the physical evidence? The crown and the documents?" "Keep them hidden and secure, but be prepared to move them quickly if necessary. If Evangeline discovers what we're doing, she'll search every inch of the palace to find anything that could be used against her." Isabella nodded, feeling both exhausted and energized by the magnitude of the task ahead. She was no longer just a princess learning about royal protocol and diplomatic etiquette. She was a key player in a deadly game that would determine the future of the kingdom. As she prepared to leave Captain Morrison's office and return to her chambers, Isabella felt the weight of the midnight crown calling to her from its hiding place. Soon, she would have the opportunity to wear it publicly and demonstrate her rightful claim to the throne. But first, she would have to survive long enough to see justice served and her mother's murder avenged. The game was becoming more complex and dangerous with each passing day, but Isabella was discovering reserves of strength and cunning that surprised even herself. Queen Evangeline might have experience in manipulation and murder, but she had never faced an opponent who combined the wisdom of the ancient royal bloodline with the fury of a daughter seeking justice for her murdered mother. The true battle for the crown was about to begin. The weeks following Isabella's alliance with Captain Morrison passed in a carefully orchestrated dance of normalcy and secret preparation. By day, she attended her lessons with the same dutiful attention she had always shown, smiled appropriately at court functions, and maintained the facade of an innocent princess approaching her coming-of-age ceremony with nothing more than typical nervousness. By night, she studied the evidence against Evangeline, memorized genealogical charts that proved her royal heritage, and gradually built a network of allies who could help her expose the truth when the time came. The transformation was subtle but profound. Isabella found herself observing conversations with new insight, noticing the undercurrents of palace politics that had previously escaped her attention. She began to understand which servants reported to Evangeline, which nobles harbored doubts about the queen's influence, and which courtiers could be trusted with sensitive information. Most importantly, she learned to hide her thoughts and emotions behind the same mask of composed serenity that she had once admired in her mother. When Evangeline made seemingly innocent inquiries about Isabella's activities or interests, Isabella responded with just the right mixture of openness and adolescent self-absorption to avoid raising suspicion. The breakthrough came during a state dinner honoring the ambassador from the neighboring kingdom of Valeria. Isabella was seated between Duke Aldrich of Westmarch and Countess Vivian of Thornfield, exactly as Captain Morrison had arranged through careful manipulation of the palace's protocol officer. Both nobles had been friends of Queen Seraphina, and both had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the changes that had swept through the court since Evangeline's rise to power. "Princess Isabella," Duke Aldrich said quietly as the servants cleared the first course, "you've grown to look remarkably like your mother. She would be so proud to see the intelligent young woman you're becoming." Isabella smiled with genuine warmth, recognizing the opening Captain Morrison had told her to watch for. "Thank you, Your Grace. I've been studying her journals recently, trying to understand the traditions and responsibilities she valued so highly." Countess Vivian leaned closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Your mother was deeply committed to preserving the ancient customs of our kingdom. She believed they were essential to maintaining the spiritual strength of the monarchy. I'm beginning to understand that myself," Isabella replied carefully, "though I sometimes wonder if there are aspects of our history that have been overlooked in recent years." The two nobles exchanged a meaningful glance, and Isabella knew that Captain Morrison had been correct in identifying them as potential allies. Duke Aldrich cleared his throat softly and said, "Perhaps we might continue this conversation in a more private setting? I would be honored to share some of the stories your mother told me about our kingdom's earlier queens." "I would enjoy that very much," Isabella said, though her pulse quickened with both excitement and apprehension. The dinner conversation moved on to safer topics, but Isabella noticed that both Duke Aldrich and Countess Vivian watched her with new interest throughout the evening. When Queen Evangeline made one of her periodic attempts to steer Isabella toward discussions of modern royal duties and the importance of adapting to contemporary expectations, both nobles listened with expressions of barely concealed disapproval. 3 days later, Isabella received an invitation to take tea with Countess Vivian at her private residence in the city. The invitation was perfectly proper and provided an excellent excuse for Isabella to leave the palace without arousing suspicion. Captain Morrison arranged for a small escort of trusted guards, and Isabella found herself sitting in an elegant drawing room that overlooked the Countess's private gardens. "Your Highness," Countess Vivian began once they were alone, "I hope you'll forgive my directness, but I feel compelled to speak honestly about certain concerns that have been weighing on my heart." Isabella set down her teacup and gave the Countess her full attention. "Please, speak freely. I served your mother faithfully for many years, and I came to understand her deep commitment to the ancient traditions that have guided our kingdom since its founding. She was particularly devoted to preserving the bloodline that connects our current monarchy to the original royal house established by Queen Aria the Wise." The Countess paused, studying Isabella's face for any sign of recognition or alarm. When Isabella nodded encouragingly, she continued,
Your mother confided in me about certain
irregularities she had discovered in the royal genealogical records. She believed that the true line of succession had been obscured by political marriages and incomplete documentation, but that careful research could reveal the rightful heir to the throne. Isabella felt her heartbeat accelerate, but she kept her expression composed. "That sounds like the kind of scholarly work my mother would find fascinating. Did she share her conclusions with you?" Countess Vivian leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Princess Isabella, your mother believed that you are the direct descendant of Queen Aria through an unbroken maternal line. According to the original laws of the kingdom, this would make you the rightful Queen of Astoria, regardless of your father's choice of successor." Isabella allowed her eyes to widen with surprise, as if this were the first time she had heard such a possibility. "That seems extraordinary. Are you certain my mother believed this?" "I am. And she died before she could present her evidence to the proper authorities." The Countess's expression grew grave. "Your Highness, I fear that your mother's death was not the accident it appeared to be." Isabella set down her teacup with shaking hands, no longer needing to feign shock. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that there are those in the palace who would do anything to prevent the true line of succession from being revealed. Your mother represented a threat to their plans, and now you may face the same danger." The conversation that followed confirmed everything Captain Morrison had told Isabella about the network of nobles who harbored suspicions about Evangeline's role in Queen Seraphina's death. Countess Vivian revealed that she had been quietly gathering evidence of her own, working with Duke Aldrich and several other trusted allies to document the suspicious circumstances surrounding the Queen's fatal riding accident. "We have statements from stable hands who were told to prepare your mother's usual horse differently that morning," the Countess explained. "We have testimonies from servants who noticed strangers in the palace the night before the accident, and we have financial records showing unusual payments made from Queen Evangeline's private accounts to individuals who have since disappeared from the capital." Isabella realized that her mother's allies had been working to uncover the truth even after her death, driven by loyalty and a desire for justice that paralleled her own motivations.
What do you propose we do with this information? Isabella asked.
"We believe the time has come to present our evidence to King Alexander, along with proof of your legitimate claim to the throne. But we need your permission to proceed, and we need your commitment to accept the responsibilities that would come with revealing your true heritage." Isabella thought of the midnight crown hidden in her chambers, of the ancient power it represented, and of the justice it could help her achieve.
Countess Vivian, if what you're telling me is true, then I have a duty to my mother's memory and to the kingdom to ensure that the rightful order is restored.
The Countess smiled with unmistakable relief and admiration. "Your mother would be so proud to hear you say that, Your Highness." Over the following weeks, Isabella found herself at the center of a carefully planned campaign to expose Evangeline's crimes and establish her own claim to the throne. Duke Aldrich provided access to legal scholars who could verify the genealogical evidence, while Countess Vivian coordinated with other noble families to build support for Isabella's cause. Captain Morrison continued to serve as their primary link to sympathetic elements within the palace guard and household staff. The evidence they gathered painted an even more damning picture of Evangeline's activities than Isabella had initially imagined. The Queen had been systematically replacing loyal palace staff with individuals who owed their positions to her patronage. She had been secretly negotiating with foreign powers to arrange advantageous marriages for her children that would strengthen her family's position at the expense of Astoria's traditional alliances. Most alarmingly, she had been quietly poisoning King Alexander with small doses of a substance that clouded his judgment and made him increasingly dependent on her guidance. The king's recent behavior makes much more sense when viewed in this context, Duke Aldrich explained during one of their secret meetings. His increasing isolation from old friends, his reluctance to make important decisions without Evangeline's input, his apparent indifference to matters that once consumed his attention. These are all symptoms of gradual poisoning designed to render him malleable rather than kill him outright.
Isabella felt sick as she realized the full scope of Evangeline's manipulation.
Her father wasn't just grieving and emotionally dependent, he was being systematically drugged to ensure his compliance with his wife's plans. "We have to act soon," she said. "If we wait much longer, the damage to my father's health may become irreversible." "I agree," Captain Morrison said, "but we need to choose our moment carefully." Evangeline is becoming suspicious of the increased activity among the noble houses that support your cause. She's been asking questions about private meetings and unusual correspondence. The opportunity they had been waiting for came in the form of a traditional ceremony that Evangeline could not avoid without raising questions about her commitment to royal protocol. The Festival of Remembrance, held annually to honor the kingdom's deceased monarchs, required the current queen to participate in public rituals that included visiting the royal crypt and laying flowers on the tombs of her predecessors. Isabella realized that this ceremony would provide the perfect setting for revealing her true heritage and exposing Evangeline's crimes. Surrounded by the tombs of legitimate queens, in the presence of representatives from every noble house, Evangeline would be forced to confront the evidence against her without the protection of her usual palace environment. The crypt contains the tomb of Queen Aria the Wise, Isabella explained to her allies during their final planning meeting. "If I can demonstrate my connection to the founding royal bloodline in that sacred space, it will carry enormous symbolic weight with both the nobility and the common people. But it will also be extremely dangerous," Captain Morrison warned. "Once you reveal your true identity and make your accusations public, there will be no going back. Evangeline will have to either accept defeat or resort to violence to protect her position." Isabella touched the hidden chain around her neck, where she now wore the key to her mother's chambers, alongside a small pendant that had belonged to Queen Aria herself. "Captain Morrison, my mother died because she was willing to sacrifice her life to protect the truth. I won't dishonor that sacrifice by choosing safety over justice." The night before the Festival of Remembrance, Isabella retrieved the midnight crown from its hiding place and held it in her hands for the first time since discovering it in the tower music room. The sapphires seemed to pulse within her light, and she could swear she felt the presence of all the queens who had worn it before her. As she carefully wrapped the crown in silk and prepared to carry it to the ceremony, Isabella whispered a prayer to her mother's spirit and to the ancient queens whose bloodline she carried. Tomorrow she would either restore justice to the kingdom or join her mother in death. But either way, the truth would finally be revealed. The game that had begun with a hidden key and a locked door was about to reach its climax in the most sacred space in the kingdom, surrounded by the tombs of queens who had faced their own moments of truth with courage and wisdom. Isabella only hoped she would prove worthy of the crown that had chosen her as its next bearer. As dawn broke over Astoria Palace, Isabella dressed for what might be the most important day in the kingdom's history. The midnight crown waited in a specially designed compartment of her ceremonial cloak, ready to be revealed when the moment was right. Her allies were positioned throughout the crowd that would gather at the royal crypt, prepared to support her revelation with their own testimonies and evidence. Queen Evangeline had no idea that her carefully constructed web of lies and murder was about to be exposed by the very princess she had dismissed as a naive child. The Festival of Remembrance would indeed be a day of remembrance, but not in the way anyone expected. The morning of the Festival of Remembrance dawned clear and bright, as if the heavens themselves had chosen to illuminate the truth that would finally be revealed. Isabella stood before her mirror, adjusting the ceremonial cloak that concealed the midnight crown, and marveled at how different she looked from the frightened girl who had first discovered her mother's hidden journals. Her face had acquired a new maturity. Her eyes held depths of knowledge and determination that spoke of someone who had faced terrible truths and emerged stronger for the experience. The festival procession began at sunrise, winding through the ancient streets of the capital as thousands of citizens lined the route to pay their respects to the royal family. Isabella rode in an open carriage beside Queen Evangeline, maintaining the facade of familial unity even as she prepared to expose the woman who had murdered her mother and poisoned her father. King Alexander followed in a separate carriage, his appearance so changed by months of subtle poisoning that many in the crowd whispered concerns about his health. Evangeline had chosen her festival attire carefully, wearing a gown of deep purple silk that emphasized her status as queen, while remaining appropriately somber for the occasion. Her golden hair was arranged beneath a simple tiara, and she carried herself with the confident bearing of someone who believed her position was unassailable. She had no idea that the evidence of her crimes was being carried just inches away from her, hidden beneath Isabella's ceremonial cloak. The royal crypt lay beneath the ancient cathedral, at the heart of the capital, its stone chambers housing the remains of every monarch who had ruled Astoria since the kingdom's founding. The air grew cooler as the royal party descended the worn stone steps, and the walls seemed to whisper with the voices of centuries of history. Isabella felt the weight of the midnight crown against her chest and drew strength from the knowledge that she was about to honor her ancestors by restoring justice to their kingdom. The ceremony began with traditional prayers offered by the high priest, followed by the laying of flowers on each royal tomb. Isabella watched as Evangeline performed her part in the ritual with perfect composure, placing white lilies on the tomb of Queen Serafina without showing the slightest sign of guilt or remorse. The sight filled Isabella with a cold fury that strengthened her resolve to expose the truth. When the formal ceremonies concluded, Isabella knew the moment had come. Duke Aldrich, Countess Vivian, and the other noble allies had positioned themselves strategically throughout the crypt, while Captain Morrison and his most trusted guards controlled the exits to prevent Evangeline from escaping before the full truth could be revealed. "Your Majesty," Isabella said, her voice carrying clearly in the stone chamber, "before we conclude today's observances, I believe there is something that must be addressed." King Alexander looked up with confusion, while Evangeline's eyes sharpened with suspicion. "What is it, Isabella?" the king asked, his voice showing the effects of the slow poisoning that had clouded his mind for months. Isabella stepped forward, moving to stand directly before the tomb of Queen Aria the Wise, the founder of their royal dynasty. "Father, I have discovered evidence about my mother's death and about the true line of succession in our kingdom that cannot be ignored any longer." Evangeline took a step toward Isabella, her hand moving instinctively to the hidden dagger she always carried. "Isabella, dear, this is hardly the appropriate time or place for—" "On the contrary," Isabella interrupted, her voice gaining strength and authority with each word. "There could be no more appropriate place than here, surrounded by the tombs of our rightful queens, to reveal the truth about murder and usurpation." The assembled nobles stirred with surprise and anticipation, while King Alexander struggled to focus on his daughter's words through the mental fog that Evangeline's poison had created. Isabella reached beneath her cloak and withdrew the midnight crown, its sapphires catching and reflecting the torchlight in brilliant flashes of blue fire. Gasps echoed through the crypt as everyone present recognized the legendary crown that had been missing for years. "This is the midnight crown, worn by every true queen of Astoria since our kingdom's founding," Isabella declared, holding the crown aloft. "It was hidden by my mother, Queen Serafina, who discovered that her life was in danger from someone who sought to eliminate the rightful royal bloodline." Evangeline's facade of composure finally cracked. "You foolish girl," she hissed, abandoning all pretense of maternal concern. "You have no idea what you're interfering with." "I know exactly what I'm interfering with," Isabella replied calmly. "I'm interfering with a pattern of murder and deception that began long before you came to our kingdom. I know about your first husband, Duke Edmund, who died of mysterious food poisoning. I know about Prince Garrett, who suffered a fatal riding accident after discovering your affair with his brother. And I know about my mother, whose horse was drugged on your orders to ensure she would never reveal the evidence she had gathered against you."
King Alexander struggled to his feet, confusion and dawning horror warring across his features.
"Isabella, what are you saying? Evangeline is my wife, she would never—" "Father, she has been slowly poisoning you for months to cloud your judgment and make you dependent on her guidance," Isabella said gently but firmly. "Captain Morrison has samples of your food that showed traces of a substance designed to impair mental function without causing obvious harm." Captain Morrison stepped forward carrying a leather portfolio identical to the one he had shown Isabella weeks earlier. "Your Majesty, I have been investigating these allegations for some time at Princess Isabella's request." "The evidence is overwhelming and undeniable." Evangeline suddenly lunged towards Isabella with the dagger she had concealed, but Captain Morrison was ready for such a move. His sword blocked her attack while his guards moved to restrain her before she could make another attempt. "You will not take what I have worked so hard to achieve," Evangeline screamed, struggling against the guards who held her. "I have eliminated everyone who stood in my way, and I will not be stopped by a naive child who thinks royal blood grants her some mystical authority." Isabella placed the midnight crown on her head and immediately felt a surge of power and clarity that seemed to connect her to every queen who had worn it before her. The crown fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for this moment to finally rest on its rightful bearer. "I am Princess Isabella of Astoria," she declared, her voice carrying with supernatural authority that silenced every person in the crypt, direct descendant of Queen Aria the Wise, through an unbroken maternal line. "According to the ancient laws of this kingdom, I claim the throne that is mine by right of blood and the grace of those who came before me." Duke Aldrich stepped forward, carrying the genealogical documents that proved Isabella's heritage. The evidence supporting Princess Isabella's claim has been verified by the kingdom's most respected scholars. She is indeed the rightful heir to the throne of Astoria. Countess Vivian joined him, presenting the testimonies and evidence that exposed Evangeline's crimes. "Queen Evangeline, you stand accused of multiple counts of murder, including the deaths of Queen Serafina and your previous husbands. You are further accused of treason, poisoning the king, and conspiracy to usurp the rightful line of succession." King Alexander sank back into his chair, the full magnitude of what he was hearing finally penetrating the chemical fog that had clouded his mind. "Evangeline," he said, his voice broken with grief and betrayal. "Is this true? Did you kill my Serafina?" Evangeline stopped struggling against her captors and fixed him with a look of cold contempt. "Your precious Serafina was a foolish woman who chose to interfere with forces beyond her understanding. I did what was necessary to protect my children's future and to prevent outdated traditions from destroying the progress I had made." The admission of guilt echoed through the stone chamber like a death knell. Several of the assembled nobles crossed themselves, while others whispered prayers for Queen Serafina's soul. Isabella felt the power of the crown flowing through her, bringing with it the wisdom of centuries of royal leadership. "Evangeline of Blackmore, by the authority granted to me by blood, by law, and by the sacred trust of this kingdom's founders, I pronounce you guilty of murder, treason, and crimes against the crown. You will be held for trial and judgment, according to the ancient laws you sought to subvert." "Father," she continued, turning to King Alexander with compassion, "you have been the victim of a systematic campaign of deception and poisoning. With proper treatment and time, you will recover from the effects of what has been done to you. Until that recovery is complete, I will serve as regent and ensure that justice is served and the kingdom is protected."
King Alexander looked at his daughter with growing recognition and pride, the mental clarity slowly returning as he began to understand the full scope of what had occurred.
"Isabella, you are truly your mother's daughter. She would be so proud to see you now."
The ceremony that followed was unlike anything in the kingdom's recorded history.
In the sacred space beneath the cathedral, surrounded by the tombs of her ancestors and witnessed by the most important nobles of the realm, Isabella was proclaimed Queen of Astoria in her own right, not merely as her father's heir, but as the legitimate descendant of the founding royal bloodline. Duke Aldrich was the first to kneel before the new queen, followed by Countess Vivian and the other nobles who had supported her cause. Even those who had been loyal to Evangeline found themselves compelled by the evidence and the obvious rightness of Isabella's claim to bend the knee in acknowledgement of her authority. "Long live Queen Isabella," Captain Morrison declared, his voice carrying through the stone chambers and up the stairs to where crowds of citizens waited to hear the outcome of the dramatic confrontation in the crypt. The news spread through the capital with the speed of wildfire. Within hours, the entire kingdom knew that their young princess had exposed a murderous conspiracy, reclaimed the legendary Midnight Crown, and assumed her rightful place as their sovereign. The people responded with a mixture of shock, relief, and celebration as they realized that justice had finally been served and their kingdom was once again ruled by the legitimate royal bloodline. In the days that followed, Isabella faced the enormous challenge of establishing her authority while dealing with the aftermath of Evangeline's crimes. The former queen was imprisoned in the Tower of Judgment to await formal trial, though few doubted what the outcome would be. Her children, who had been innocent of their mother's crimes, were placed under the protection of trusted noble families until their futures could be determined. King Alexander, freed from the effects of Evangeline's poisoning, proved to be a valuable advisor as Isabella learned to navigate the complexities of ruling a kingdom. His health gradually improved, and with it came a renewed sense of purpose as he helped his daughter undo the damage that had been done during Evangeline's influence over the court. "You have shown wisdom far beyond your years," he told Isabella, as they worked together to reform the kingdom's administration and restore the traditional institutions that Evangeline had tried to undermine. "Your mother would be amazed to see how you've grown into the leader she always knew you could become." The trial of Evangeline proved to be a sensation throughout the known world, as representatives from neighboring kingdoms came to witness the proceedings and learn the full scope of her crimes. The evidence presented was so overwhelming that even Evangeline's own legal counsel advised her to confess in hopes of avoiding the most severe punishment available under Astorian law.
But Evangeline remained defiant to the end, showing no remorse for her actions and expressing only anger at being thwarted in her ambitions.
"I regret nothing," she declared when given the opportunity to address the court.
I did what was necessary to secure power in a world that grants women few opportunities to shape their own destinies. History will vindicate my actions when others understand the necessity of what I accomplished. Queen Isabella, wearing the midnight crown as she presided over the trial, responded with the kind of regal authority that her ancestors would have recognized and approved. History will remember you as a murderer who stole what was never yours and who destroyed innocent lives in pursuit of power that you could never legitimately claim. Your legacy will serve as a warning to others who might be tempted to follow your path. The formal execution took place at dawn on a crisp autumn morning, witnessed by representatives from every noble house, and attended by thousands of citizens who had come to see justice finally served.
Evangeline met her fate with the same cold composure she had maintained throughout her life, showing neither fear nor repentance as she faced the consequences of her actions. Isabella did not attend the execution, choosing instead to spend the morning in the royal chapel, praying for her mother's soul and for the wisdom to rule justly. The burden of wearing the crown had proven to be everything her mother's journals had suggested it would be, a mixture of tremendous power and overwhelming responsibility that required constant vigilance and unwavering dedication to the kingdom's welfare. In the months that followed, Queen Isabella proved herself to be a ruler worthy of her legendary crown. She restored the ancient customs and traditions that connected the monarchy to its historical roots, while also implementing progressive reforms that addressed the needs of a changing world. Her court became a center of learning and justice, attracting scholars, artists, and diplomats from across the continent who were eager to witness the renaissance that had begun under her leadership. The midnight crown, no longer hidden away but worn with pride during state occasions, served as a constant reminder of the price of truth and the importance of protecting the institutions that had made Astoria great. Isabella established new laws designed to prevent the kind of conspiracy and corruption that had nearly destroyed the kingdom, while also creating mechanisms to ensure that future rulers would be held accountable for their actions. Captain Morrison was elevated to the position of Lord Protector, responsible for the personal safety of the royal family and the investigation of any threats to the kingdom's security. Duke Aldrich became the Queen's chief advisor, while Countess Vivian took on the role of overseeing the education and welfare of the kingdom's noble daughters, ensuring that future generations would understand both their privileges and their responsibilities. The story of Queen Isabella's rise to power became legend throughout the known world, inspiring other kingdoms to examine their own traditions and institutions for signs of corruption or decay. The young queen who had uncovered a murderous conspiracy and reclaimed her rightful throne became a symbol of justice and legitimate authority, proving that truth would ultimately triumph over even the most carefully constructed deceptions. Years later, as Isabella stood on the balcony of Astoria Palace watching her own daughter play in the gardens below, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her from a naive princess to a respected queen. The midnight crown rested in its place of honor in the royal treasury, waiting for the day when it would choose its next bearer from among Isabella's descendants. The lessons learned from Evangeline's treachery had been woven into the kingdom's laws and customs, ensuring that future generations would be better protected against those who might seek to subvert the natural order through violence and deception. The memory of Queen Seraphina was honored with a magnificent monument in the palace gardens, while her journals were preserved as historical documents that future historians could study to understand the importance of vigilance in protecting democratic institutions. But perhaps most importantly, the kingdom had learned that true authority came not from political manipulation or married titles, but from the combination of legitimate heritage, personal integrity, and dedication to the common good. Queen Isabella had proven that the ancient traditions connecting rulers to their people were not outdated superstitions, but essential elements of good government that required constant protection and renewal. As the sun set over the capital city, casting long shadows across the palace walls, Isabella touched the pendant at her throat that contained a small fragment of the midnight crown's setting. The crown itself would rest safely in its treasury vault, but its power and its lessons lived on in every decision she made as queen and every law she enacted to protect her people. The game that had begun with a hidden key and a locked door had ended with justice served, truth revealed, and a kingdom restored to its rightful path. Isabella had proven herself worthy of the crown that had chosen her, and in doing so, she had honored the memory of all the queens who had come before her, while setting an example that would guide all the queens yet to come. The midnight crown had found its rightful bearer, and the kingdom of Astoria
had found its way back to the principles and traditions that had made it great. The truth, as it always did, had finally set them free.